There is a word that appears 66 times in the Hebrew Bible, and in almost every translation you have ever read, it has been quietly replaced with something softer, something manageable, something that does not mean what the original word means at all. The translators called it the grave. They called it the pit. Some called it death. But the ancient Israelites had perfectly good words for all of those things, and this was not one of them. This word was something older, something that predated the moral architecture of heaven and hell entirely, something that did not wait for you to sin before it started pulling. The word is Sheol, and the reason translators have spent 3,000 years reaching for synonyms is that Sheol, in its original conception, is not a place the wicked go. It is the place everything goes, the righteous and the corrupt, the infant and the tyrant, the man who spent his life in prayer and the man who spent his life in violence. All of them, in the oldest strata of the Hebrew tradition, descending into the same suffocating dark. And if that cosmology makes you uncomfortable, hold on to that discomfort, because it gets significantly worse. What follows is not a theological debate. It is a geographic survey. The ancient world did not describe Sheol in metaphors. They described it the way a soldier describes a prison he has personally inspected, with specific chambers, named levels, architectural gates with iron bars, and atmospheric conditions calibrated to a particular kind of destruction. There is a map, and we are going to read it. But to understand where Sheol leads, you first have to understand what its name means, because the name is not an accident. The name is a warning. Sometime around the 10th century before the Common Era, scribes working in the courts of ancient Israel began to argue about the etymology of this word they had inherited. Two camps emerged, and the debate between them reveals something about the ancient mind that no Sunday school curriculum has ever quite managed to transmit. The first camp derived Sheol from the Hebrew root sha'al, a verb meaning to ask, to inquire, to demand. Not a polite requesting, a ravenous, perpetual demanding. Under this reading, Sheol is not a location, it is an appetite. The scholar William Foxwell Albright, one of the 20th century's most decorated biblical archaeologists, traced this root to a concept of post-mortem interrogation, a place where the soul does not simply arrive, but is immediately subjected to a stripping inquisition, cross-examined by the abyss itself. The 19th century linguist Hirsch pushed it further still, connecting Sha'al back to the curse of Genesis, the dust-to-dust verdict handed down in the garden, and arguing that the grave does not passively receive the body. It requests it, continuously, by name. The second camp read the word differently. Their root was sha'ah, meaning hollow, deep, desolate. Under this reading, Sheol is not a creature but a cavity, a geological fact, a vast, hollow space existing beneath the tectonic foundations of the world, waiting to be filled. The hollow earth cosmology that would later fascinate European thinkers in the Age of Enlightenment was not an eccentric theory to the ancient Near East. It was architecture. It was physics. The dead did not go somewhere else. They went down, into the structural negative space beneath the crust of the earth, into a cavity that the Hebrews shared conceptually with the Sumerians, who called it Kur, with the Akkadians, who called it Irkala, with the Mesopotamians, who had been mapping its interior for 1,000 years before the first Hebrew scribe put reed to clay. Here is what strikes me about those two etymologies, standing 3 millennia later and watching scholars still argue about them. The debate was never resolved because both answers are true simultaneously. Sheol is hollow and Sheol is hungry. It is a geographic void and an active predator. That combination, the empty space that demands to be filled, the cavern that reaches upward with an open throat, is not a contradiction. It is a description of something that does not have a comfortable, modern name. The closest analogy in contemporary physics is a black hole, a singularity, a point where the normal rules of matter and energy collapse inward. The ancient world did not have that vocabulary, but they had the concept, buried 6 letters deep in the word they kept reaching for whenever they needed to describe the place they were most afraid of. What they were not afraid of, in the earliest texts, was moral stratification. And this is the detail that modern readers consistently miss, the detail that changes what the entire tradition means. In the oldest layers of the Hebrew Bible, Sheol does not sort, it does not punish, it does not distinguish between the life well lived and the life squandered on cruelty. The book of Job describes it as the place where the wicked cease from troubling and the weary are at rest, in the same sentence, about the same destination. Ecclesiastes shrugs toward it with almost clinical indifference, noting that the dead know nothing and that their love and their hate and their envy have already perished. Whatever the soul was before it descended, Sheol reduces it to something called the Rephaim, a word usually translated as shades, but which carries in its root the specific connotation of weakness, of the enfeebled, of the trembling. Picture the throne rooms of Mesopotamia. The kings who had commanded armies of 10,000 men, who had spoken and watched provinces tremble, who had been carried on litters through cities that existed only because of their word. Picture those men stripped of every external structure of power, their crowns dissolved, their names no longer recognized even by the air around them, reduced to trembling, semi-transparent echoes of the thing they used to be. That is the Rephaim. That is what Sheol does to everyone, without exception, regardless of what they deserved. The atmosphere of this upper threshold is described in the book of Job with a specificity that reads less like theology and more like the report of someone who went there and came back badly shaken. It is the land of darkness and the shadow of death, a land of thick darkness, a place where even the light is like darkness. Job 10 renders this in a sequence of clauses that accelerates like a body falling, each phrase darker than the last, the syntax itself replicating the sensation of descent. The ancient Israelite scribes were not writing metaphor here. They were describing a sensory environment. No sound, no smell, no warmth. Dust for air, clay for sustenance. The complete and absolute removal of every stimulus that tells a living organism it exists. What the scholars call sensory deprivation, the scribes called Sheol. And the horror of it is not fire, not yet. The horror of the upper threshold is its silence. Psalm 115 states it with the flat certainty of someone reporting a geographic fact. The dead do not praise the divine. There is no sound in Sheol, no remembrance, no praise, no petition. The kingdom of silence is not a punishment. It is just the atmospheric condition of the place, the way cold is the atmospheric condition of the deep ocean, present not because anyone decided it should be there, but because of the physics of the environment. The ancient scribes had a phrase for it, Eretz HaChaim, the land of the living. Everything above the surface, everything warm and loud and kinetic and temporary, everything that bleeds and hungers and reaches toward light. And then, underneath it, separated by nothing more than the thickness of the ground beneath your feet at this exact moment, the kingdom of absolute stillness, Sheol. pressing upward against the underside of the world you are currently standing on. That proximity is the part the translations never quite managed to convey. The ancient world did not experience death as a journey to a distant realm. They experienced it as a descent into the infrastructure of the planet they already inhabited. The soil of the Levant was not just dirt to them, it was the ceiling of another world. Every field they plowed, they were plowing the roof of the kingdom of the dead. And what waited below that ceiling was not the simple, undifferentiated silence of the grave they knew. Because by the time the later scribes began to systematize what the earlier tradition had only glimpsed, the silence of the upper threshold was just the first room. Behind it were 6 more, each one darker, louder, hotter, and more precisely engineered than the last. Each one with a name. Each one with a specific atmospheric condition, calibrated to accomplish something the one above it could not. The ancient world built a prison beneath the world, and the excavation of its architecture, the 7 tiers of what later Jewish tradition would call Gehinnom, is the most unsettling document in the entire history of religious cosmology. Not because it describes fire. Fire is easy. Fire is comprehensible. What is not comprehensible, what the ancient cartographers of the underworld understood, and what we have spent 3 millennia trying to forget, is that the prison was not built for the wicked. It was built because the universe requires a place where everything terminates. And what that place looks like, what it is made of, what it does to the thing that enters it, is what we are going to explore next. Because what you just learned about the silence and the dust and the hollow place beneath your feet is only the vestibule. The architects of the abyss had a name for the 2nd tier. They called it Abaddon, the place of annihilation. And the reason it needed a different name from Sheol is that something different happens there, something that cannot be undone. And the ancient texts are very, very specific about what it is. The architects of the ancient world understood something that modern engineers have only recently confirmed through seismographic imaging. The Earth is not solid. Beneath the crust, beneath the mantle, the planet contains vast regions of molten material, of pressurized cavities, of zones where the normal rules of solid matter break down entirely. When ancient Israelite and Babylonian scribes described the underworld as a structured, tiered architecture embedded in the physical geology of the planet, they were not writing mythology. They were writing what they believed to be infrastructure. And the infrastructure they described is, tier by tier, a document of horror so methodical and so precise that it reads less like religious cosmology and more like an engineering specification for a facility designed to process something that cannot be destroyed, but must be contained. The Babylonian Talmud, Tractate Eruvin, page 19, side 1, lists them by name. 7 compartments, 7 distinct atmospheric environments, each one engineered to accomplish a specific kind of undoing. Later texts, the Midrash Tehillim, the Reshit Chokhmah, the 8th century mystical compendium known as the Alphabet of Rabbi Akiva, add spatial coordinates, sensory descriptions, and in some cases, the exact category of transgression that routes a soul to each specific level. This is not vague apocalyptic poetry. This is a filing system, a taxonomy of termination. What strikes anyone who reads these texts carefully, what the summary versions and the YouTube explainers consistently miss, is the architectural genius embedded in the design. The 7 tiers are not simply escalating versions of the same punishment. They are a staged sequence of sensory transformations, each one specifically calibrated to destroy a different layer of what a soul is. The ancient architects understood that identity is not a single thing. It is a stack of things, built up over a lifetime, and the way you dismantle it completely is not to attack the whole stack at once. You remove it one layer at a time, from the outside inward. The outermost layer is context. The upper threshold, the silence of Sheol, strips away everything external. The sounds of the world above, the textures, the warmth, the sensation of being inside a body that is moving through space. The soul arrives at the threshold already deprived of every sensory anchor it has relied upon since birth, suspended in the dusty, lightless quiet of the upper cavern, and for a time it retains the illusion that the self beneath those sensory anchors is still intact. Then it descends to Abaddon. The Hebrew word Abaddon derives from the root abad, meaning to perish, to be destroyed, to be lost. But the specific construction of the noun points not to the act of destruction, but to the place where destruction is accomplished, the facility of annihilation, the dedicated chamber where the process of coming apart is completed. In the book of Job, Abaddon is personified as an entity with a dark, sentient awareness, listed alongside death as one of the two presences that know the location of wisdom and have nothing to say about it. In Proverbs, it appears as the insatiable partner of Sheol, the two of them together constituting a hunger that is never full. What the ancient texts describe happening in Abaddon is the systematic dismantling of what psychologists would now call autobiographical memory, the residual ego, the internal architecture of the self that persists even after all external sensation is removed. The part that says, I remember who I was. I remember what I built. I remember the faces of people who needed me. And I remember that I was the person who stood between them and the dark. That part. Abaddon is where that part goes to be undone in total darkness. The decomposition of the psychological self proceeding in exact parallel to the decomposition of the physical body in the grave above. There is a detail here that the source texts almost never make explicit, but that the architecture implies with terrible clarity. The process in Abaddon is not painful in the way fire is painful. It is painful in the way forgetting is painful. The slow erosion of the thing you believed was permanent about yourself. Anyone who has watched a person they love disappear into the late stages of a neurodegenerative disease has witnessed a shadow of what Abaddon describes. The body still present, the warmth still there, but the specific configuration of memory and personality and recognition that made that person themselves dissolving tier by tier, layer by layer, without violence, without drama, in a darkness so complete that the process cannot even be witnessed by the one undergoing it. That is the second tier. The soul is not yet being punished. It is being unpacked. The third tier is where the geometry changes. Be'er Shachat, the well of corruption. The name is architectural rather than atmospheric, a vertical shaft rather than a horizontal chamber, and the shift is significant. The soul is no longer held in a broad, silent space. It is in a tube, a suffocating, downward-oriented column, where the geological weight of the earth above presses inward from every direction, and the substance of the walls is described in the ancient texts as putrefaction, as the physical matter of corruption itself, dense and viscous, and pressing inward. The psychological mechanism here is the one the ancient architects understood better than almost any other. Claustrophobia is not primarily a fear of small spaces. It is a fear of the impossibility of agency. The terror is not the walls. The terror is the recognition that no action you can take, no strength you possess, no will you bring to bear will move those walls by a single millimeter. Agency, the fundamental human experience of being able to affect change in the environment around you, is the specific thing Be'er Shakat is designed to remove. After Abaddon has dissolved the memory of who you were, Be'er Shakat dissolves the belief that anything you do matters. It is the third layer of the self, removed in sequence. What comes after Be'er Shakat is the moment the architecture pivots, and the pivot is so violent, so counterintuitive, that every reader of these ancient texts has to stop and reconsider what they thought they understood about the structure of suffering. The fourth tier is called Bor Sha'on in some texts and Tit Ha-Yaven in others, the pit of tumultuous waters and the miry clay. And after 3 tiers of progressive silence, of sensory deprivation widening into psychological dissolution, the 4th tier is deafening. Consider what that means for a moment. The soul has descended through absolute stillness, through the voiceless darkness of the upper threshold, through the disintegration of Abaddon, through the crushing claustrophobia of Be'er Shakat. And then the floor drops away, and the silence shatters into something the ancient texts describe as subterranean cataracts, roaring rivers running through the bedrock of the earth, hydraulic forces of a scale and power that have no surface equivalent. The sound of the primordial deep in full kinetic violence directly beneath the feet. Simultaneously, and this detail is the one that separates the ancient architects from any modern horror writer who has attempted to describe this space, the floor of the 4th tier is not stone. It is Tit Ha-Yaven, miry clay, viscous, primordial earth matter that behaves like quicksand, that offers no purchase, that denies every attempt at spatial stability. The soul that has just had its agency stripped away in Be'er Shakat is now dropped into an environment where the ground moves, where the water roars from all directions, where every instinct screams to establish footing, and no footing exists. The sensory deprivation of the upper tiers was a specific kind of suffering. This is its exact opposite: sensory overload, calibrated to the specific terror of drowning without water, of being consumed by the earth itself, slowly, with no dramatic moment of submersion, just the incremental loss of everything above the knee, then the waist, then the chest, in silence suddenly replaced by the deafening roar of the deep. The genius, if you can call it that, is the sequencing. By the time the soul arrives at the 4th tier, it has no memory of who it was, no belief in its own agency, no external sensation to anchor it, and no psychological floor to stand on. What the 4th tier adds is chaos, unresolvable structural chaos. The roaring and the mire together constitute an environment where the mind cannot stop searching for a pattern that does not exist, cannot stop trying to establish order in a space that has been specifically engineered to prevent it. After Bor Sha'on, the 5th tier, Duma, the gates of death. And here the architecture goes still again, but differently. Not the soft, dusty stillness of the upper threshold, a fortified stillness, heavy gates, iron bars, the specific silence that exists inside a sealed structure, the silence of a space that has been deliberately closed against the possibility of sound. The ancient texts place a guardian here, the dark angel Duma, the angel whose name means literally silence, standing at the partition between the kinetic violence of the middle tiers and the final descent, inspecting everything that passes through. The gates of Duma do not exist to keep God out of the abyss. The later theological tradition is explicit about this. They exist to ensure that nothing, once admitted to the final two tiers, returns. The sixth tier is Tzalmavet, the shadow of death. And the name requires more attention than it usually receives, because the word Tzalmavet does not describe ordinary darkness. It describes darkness that has acquired the properties of a substance. The ancient writers understood that there is a qualitative difference between the absence of light and darkness as a thing that exists, that has weight, that presses against the skin, that the body must move through rather than simply existing within. At the depth of the sixth tier, the proximity to the seventh and final level has done something to the fabric of space itself. The shadows are not where the light failed to reach. The shadows are the medium. The shadow is what everything is made of at this depth. And the seventh, the terminus, Gehenna, Eretz Hataktit, the lowest earth, the furnace. The ancient texts describe it in thermal terms, because thermal terms are the only human vocabulary that approaches what proximity to the Earth's core actually produces. The Rambam, Maimonides, commenting on the mechanics of this lowest hell, describes a strange heating up, an intensification of thermal gradient that exceeds every human analogy. The prophet Malachi described it as burning like a furnace. The Vilna Gaon, the great 18th century Lithuanian scholar, categorized the seventh tier as the true locus of Abaddon, the total annihilation, the core repository for the most severe cosmic infractions, where existence itself is threatened with erasure. But here is the detail that the ancient architects embedded in the seventh tier that is almost never discussed. The detail that makes the entire seven-tier system structurally coherent in a way that goes far beyond simple escalation of punishment. The fire of the seventh tier is not imported. It is not a punishment applied from outside. It is generated by the proximity of the level to the core of the earth itself, by the simple physics of depth, by the fact that the bedrock of the universe runs hot at its center, and the deepest tier of the abyss sits closest to that heat. The suffering is not administered. It is atmospheric. It is the natural environmental condition of the space. In other words, the ancient architects described an underworld where the punishment is not a policy decision, but a physics consequence. The soul is not being tormented by a warden. It is experiencing what the environment of that depth produces in anything that exists within it. The abyss does not punish because it hates. It processes because that is what its structure requires. There is a passage from the Epic of Gilgamesh, Tablet 7, that the biblical writers almost certainly knew and deliberately built upon. Enkidu, the wild man, the beloved companion of Gilgamesh, dreams his death before it comes. An avian figure, dark-feathered, with the hands and feet of an eagle, descends and takes him. Enkidu describes being led into the house of darkness, the house from which there is no return, where dust is their fare and clay their food. He describes the former kings who ruled the world stripped of their crowns. He describes high priests reduced to trembling servants in the dark. He describes them clothed like birds, with wings for garments. And he describes the absolute silence, the specific and terrible silence of a place where no light has ever penetrated, not once, not for a single instant, since the day the world was made. What Enkidu is describing in his dream is the upper threshold of the system we have been mapping. What he cannot yet see, what his dream does not permit him to descend far enough to witness, is what exists below the dust, below the silence, below the gate of iron bars and the angel named Silence, below the darkness that has become a substance. What he cannot see is the furnace at the bottom of everything, the seventh level, where the geological heat of the planet's core meets the souls that have traveled farthest from the surface of the living world. There is a figure who has been there, not in metaphor, not in theology, but in one of the oldest surviving texts in the entire Near Eastern tradition, a goddess who descended through all 7 gates and arrived at the throne of the queen of the underworld, stripped of everything, impaled on a hook, dead. And what happened when the living world noticed she was gone, when the seasons stopped and the animals ceased to reproduce and the grain refused to grow, is the oldest story the world has ever told about the relationship between the surface of the living and the machinery of the deep. Her name was Inanna, and what she did to get out is the part of the story that changes what you think you know about the 7 gates, about the stripping of the self, about what the underworld was actually designed to accomplish. Not what it does to the dead, what it does to the living who are brave or desperate enough to follow them in. For most of recorded history, the question of what happens after death has been answered with geography. You go somewhere. The somewhere has a location. The location has rules. This is not metaphysics. This is civic planning. And the detail that separates the ancient Israelite tradition from almost every other ancient tradition is the moment, datable with reasonable precision to somewhere around the 5th century before the Common Era, when the geography of the underworld stopped being a neutral waiting room and became a courthouse. Something changed, not in the world, in the texts, in the way the scribes understood the architecture they had inherited from their Mesopotamian predecessors and the earlier layers of their own tradition. The Sheol of Job and Ecclesiastes, the great indiscriminate equalizer where the king and the slave converge in the same dusty silence, began to develop interior walls, partitions, classification systems. The dead were no longer simply the dead. They were sorted, and the sorting mechanism was moral. Scholars who study the Second Temple period, roughly 500 years before the Common Era to 70 years after it, describe this shift as one of the most significant theological revisions in the history of Israelite religion. What drove it is still debated. Some point to the Persian influence following the Babylonian exile, the Zoroastrian tradition arriving with the conquerors and depositing its moral cosmology into the soil of a people who had just watched their temple burned and their city emptied. Others point to a purely internal logic, the ancient problem that the neutral Sheol of the earliest texts could not resolve. If the righteous and the wicked receive the same destination, then what exactly is the moral weight of a life? Whatever drove the change, the result is documented in extraordinary detail in one of the most underread texts in the entire Western religious canon. 1 Enoch, chapter 22, a book so important to the earliest followers of Jesus that it is directly quoted in the New Testament letter of Jude, yet so thoroughly excised from the official canon by later church councils that most people today have never heard of it. A book that contains, in its 22nd chapter, the most precise geographic survey of the interim state of the dead that any ancient tradition has ever produced. Enoch is taken by the archangel Raphael westward, toward the setting of the sun, to a location beneath a subterranean mountain. What he finds there is not the undifferentiated cavity of the earlier tradition. What he finds is a facility. 4 distinct hollow places, deep and smooth and deliberately partitioned, each one designed to contain a specific category of dead. The Greek word used in the oldest manuscripts is koilomata, cavities, voids, specifically excavated spaces, the word an architect would use for a chamber that was cut rather than formed by natural geology. One hollow is for the righteous, and the detail Enoch uses to mark it is the one that should stop every reader cold. because it is so specific, so geographically precise, so unlike the language of poetry or abstraction that it demands to be read as a report. In this hollow, Enoch observes a bright spring of water, in the underworld, in the dry, dusty silence beneath the mountain, in the lightless cavity where the dead are held until the final judgment. One chamber contains a source of living water. The light in that chamber, if there is light, would catch on the surface of that spring. It would move. In a kingdom of absolute stagnation, in a place where the defining atmospheric condition of every tier is the absence of kinetic energy, this one hollow has water that flows. This is the space that later Jewish and Christian tradition would call the bosom of Abraham. The place where Lazarus is comforted across an impassable chasm in the parable Luke preserves. The detail of the impassable chasm, the unbridgeable gap between the comforted and the tormented, is already structurally present in Enoch's vision of the four hollows, already built into the architecture of the space before the parable writer reached for it. The chasm is not theological metaphor. It is a feature of the engineering. The remaining hollows in Enoch's survey are for sinners, but the classification does not stop there. This is where the Second Temple architects made their most significant contribution to the cartography of the dead, the one that distinguishes their system from anything that came before it. The sinners are not a single category. They are sorted by a principle that, once you see it, is impossible to unsee. The sorting criterion is not the severity of the sin. It is whether the sinner was punished in their earthly lifetime. This distinction is not casual. It is structural. Those who committed great wickedness and received justice for it during their lives are held in one chamber. Those who committed great wickedness and were never held accountable, who lived and died in comfort despite what they had done, who never faced consequence, are held separately in a chamber of great pain, tightly bound in darkness. The architecture of the underworld has been specifically engineered to complete what the surface world left unfinished. I want to sit with that for a moment, because it contains an observation about human psychology that the ancient world made with perfect clarity, and that we have spent 3,000 years trying to find secular language for. The soul that experienced justice on earth arrives at the interim state already processed, already through something. The soul that experienced impunity arrives still carrying the unresolved weight of every act that went unanswered. And the ancient cartographers, whether they understood it in these terms or not, designed the architecture to address that weight specifically. The second chamber is not more painful than the first because God is angrier about unpunished sinners. It is more painful because those souls arrive carrying something the others do not, and the chamber is built to extract it. There is a layer of the underworld, however, that the four hollows of Enoch's survey were never designed to hold. A layer so deep, so structurally fortified, so alien in its geography to the upper hollows of the human dead, that it occupies a different section of the cosmological architecture entirely. The maximum security wing. The containment matrix built not for human souls, but for something that fell further and hit harder when it landed. 1 Enoch, chapter 10, designates it. Chapters 18 and 21 provide the geographic survey. And what the survey reveals is a sector of the underworld that sits, in the spatial logic of the ancient texts, at the boundary between the created order and whatever exists outside it. Not beneath the earth in the way that Sheol is beneath the earth, beneath the possibility of ordinary location. A space that the text describes as sitting outside the normal bounds of heaven and earth, an extra-dimensional cleft in the fabric of reality, where the rules that govern the upper hollows do not apply. The entities held here are the Watchers, the beings described in Genesis 6 as the sons of God who descended to earth, took human women, and produced offspring of catastrophic scale, the Nephilim, the giants whose violence the flood was engineered to erase. The Watchers themselves survived the flood in chains, and the chains are not metaphorical. Enoch receives a technical specification for the binding of the chief of the Watchers, an entity named Azazel, and the specification is so mechanically precise that it reads like a containment protocol. Bind him hand and foot. Make an opening in the desert of Dudael. Cast him in. Place upon him rough and jagged rocks. Cover him with darkness. Let him abide there forever. Cover his face, that he may not see light. Dudael. The scholars who have traced this coordinate link it with reasonable certainty to the rocky ravines of the Judean wilderness, a specific topography of jagged stone and airless heat that would later serve as the geographic site of the Yom Kippur scapegoat ritual, the day when the sins of an entire people were loaded onto a living animal and driven off a cliff into the same wilderness. The connection is not coincidental. The ancient tradition was consistent in its geographic imagination. The place where the chief transgressor of the cosmic order was imprisoned in chains beneath jagged rocks is the same wilderness where sin itself was annually hurled on the Day of Atonement. The geography of punishment had a postal code, and the Israelites knew it. But Dudael is not the deepest point of this maximum security sector. Enoch travels further, and what he witnesses at the furthest reach of his survey is the detail that no ancient cosmological text has ever surpassed in its combination of visual precision and architectural terror. A great fire burning in the dark. Not the fire of the seventh tier, not the atmospheric heat generated by proximity to the Earth's core. A different fire, burning from a cleft in reality itself, a fissure that descends into the abyss with no visible floor, no measurable depth, a bottomless split in the fabric of creation, from which columns of fire extend upward, writhing and massive. And Enoch stands at the edge of this, and cannot determine its extent or its size because it exceeds every category of measurement the living world provides. This is the prison of the stars, the place where the celestial entities who transgressed the divine order, the very powers and principalities that were supposed to govern the movements of the heavens and the cycles of the earth, are held in perpetual, burning suspension. Not punished, suspended, awaiting a judgment that has not yet arrived. The fire they burn in is not the consequence of their transgression. It is the holding condition while the cosmic trial continues. There is a detail here that the ancient world understood and that the modern world has almost entirely lost. The concept of the divine court, the heavenly tribunal, the cosmic legal proceeding that has been running continuously since before the creation of the material world, with the Watchers and their offspring as the defendants, and the archangels as the prosecuting attorneys, and the entire created order as the evidence. The fire at the bottom of Enoch's survey is not a verdict. It is a remand condition. The entities in it have been found dangerous and locked in containment, pending the outcome of a trial that will not conclude until the end of history. The archangel Raphael does not explain to Enoch why the trial has taken so long. The text does not address the delay. And sitting with that silence, sitting with the image of the fire that has been burning since before the flood, since before the kingdoms of Mesopotamia, since before the scribes who wrote this down were born and died and descended into the upper hollows of the very facility they were mapping, I notice something that none of the scholarly commentaries on 1st Enoch have quite named. The Watchers fell because they crossed a boundary. They were celestial entities who descended into the material world and took what the material world contained, specifically life, specifically the life of human women, specifically the continuation of the human line through children who should not have existed. They moved in a direction they were not designed to move, downward, into matter, into flesh, into the clay of the earth. And the punishment for that downward movement was a further downward movement, into the cleft at the bottom of everything, into the fire that burns without consuming, into the place where direction itself ceases to function. The ancient world had a word for the force that pulled everything toward that deepest cleft, the same force that pulled the Rephaim into the dust, that pulled Inanna through the 7 gates, that pulled the kings of Mesopotamia off their thrones and into the trembling dark. The word was Sheol, the entity whose name meant the hollow and the demand simultaneously. And the detail that the judicial evolution of the Second Temple tradition added to that oldest conception is the one that makes the entire architecture finally coherent, the one that connects the neutral waiting room of the earliest texts to the maximum security cleft of Enoch's survey. The abyss was always a court. The first scribes who described its silence simply did not yet know that the silence was the sound of proceedings already underway. The Rephaim trembling in the dust were not simply weak. They were waiting for a verdict. The iron bars of the gates of death were not simply a physical feature of the architecture. They were the locked doors of a facility still in session. And the archangels who carried the architectural specifications for Azazel's imprisonment, who received the coordinates of Dudael and the instructions for the jagged rocks and the darkness and the covered face, were not soldiers following orders. They were officers of a court whose jurisdiction extended from the surface of the living world all the way down to the fire at the bottom of the fissure that has no floor. What has not yet been addressed, what the entire framework of the judicial evolution and the cartography of the hollows and the maximum security prison of the Watchers has carefully approached but not yet entered, is the question of the foundation, the bedrock on which this entire structure rests. Because the underworld of the ancient Near East was not built on stone. It was built on water. Specifically, on the primordial water that existed before the first day of creation, before the division of the waters above and the waters below, before the dry land appeared and the first seed was planted in the first soil of the world that would eventually produce the dust that Sheol was waiting to reclaim. The name for that water was Tehom, the deep, and the oldest surviving map of the underworld, the Sumerian blueprint that the Israelite scribes inherited and transformed and built their 7-tiered courthouse upon, was drawn by scribes who understood that the abyss and the deep were the same word pointing in 2 directions, down into the prison and back before the beginning, before the fire, before the gates and the hollows and the silence, to the moment when there was nothing but water and darkness and the surface of the deep moving beneath the breath of something that had not yet decided to make light. Before the beginning of everything, there was water. Not the water you know, not the water that collects in a glass or falls on a city or runs cold from a faucet at 3 in the morning when you cannot sleep. This was something older than the category of water. The ancient scribes called it Tehom, the deep, the primordial abyss. And what they understood, with a precision that no translation has quite managed to preserve, is that the word Tehom and the word that means the underworld are not 2 different words pointing at 2 different things. They are the same word, pointing in 2 directions simultaneously, down into the prison, and backward before the beginning, to the moment when there was nothing but darkness and the surface of the deep moving beneath the breath of something that had not yet decided to make light. This is the foundation everything else is built on. Literally. The 7 tiers of the biblical underworld, the judicial hollows of Enoch's survey, the maximum security cleft where the fire burns without a visible floor. All of it sits on top of the Tehom, floating in it, suspended within it, the way a stone is suspended in deep water before it finds the bottom. And this means that the architecture we have been mapping does not terminate at the 7th tier. It terminates at the water, at the primordial aquifer that runs beneath the lowest earth, hydraulic pressure of a scale that makes the roaring cataracts of the 4th tier seem, by comparison, like the sound of a faucet tripping in a quiet house. But to understand why the ancient architects built the underworld on top of an ocean, you have to follow the goddess who went in first. Not as a shade, not as a dead woman descending into the dust, as a living being, wearing her full divine power, crossing the threshold of the first gate with her crown still on her head and her full authority still intact, descending by choice into the one place that was designed to leave nothing of you standing. Her name was Inanna, and what she discovered is the oldest story the world has ever told about what the underworld is actually for. The Sumerian myth of the descent of Inanna predates the biblical tradition by at least 1,000 years, and the scribes who composed the Hebrew underworld texts certainly knew it. The parallels are not coincidental borrowings, the kind of casual cultural osmosis that happens when civilizations trade grain and pottery. They are structural. The architecture of the biblical 7 tiers replicates the mechanism of the Sumerian 7 gates, with a precision that implies the later scribes were working from the same blueprint, consciously. Here is that blueprint. Inanna, the queen of heaven and earth, the most powerful divine force in the Sumerian pantheon, decides to descend into the great below, the realm of her sister Ereshkigal, the queen of the great earth. Why she makes this decision depends on which version of the text you read. Some scholars argue she descends to claim dominion over the underworld itself, to expand her sovereignty. Others read a grief into it, a response to the death of someone she loved. The ancient text does not fully resolve the question, and sitting with that ambiguity for a moment, I notice that those two motivations are not as different as they seem. The desire to dominate a thing and the grief of losing someone to it often feel, from the inside, exactly the same. Before she descends, Inanna instructs her servant Ninshubur to wait for her. If she does not return in 3 days, go to the father gods, beg them to bring her back. This detail, the 3 days, the instruction given before the descent, the plan for resurrection embedded in the farewell, is the kind of thing that scholars of comparative mythology have spent careers writing about. I'm going to set it aside, because what happens at the gates is more important for the cartography we are drawing. At the first gate, Inanna is stopped by the gatekeeper Neti. She presents herself. She is allowed through. But the price of entry is her great crown, the shugura, the crown of the steppe, the marker of her celestial authority. She passes through the gate without it. At the second gate, her earrings. At the third, the double strand of beads around her neck. At the fourth, the breastplate they call, "Come, man, come." At the fifth, the gold ring on her wrist. At the sixth, the measuring rod and line, the instruments of her power over the material world. At the seventh gate, the royal robe itself, the breechcloth. She enters the throne room of Ereshkigal naked, stripped of everything. And the Anunnaki, the 7 judges of the underworld, fix upon her the eyes of death. Ereshkigal speaks the word against her. Inanna is struck dead and hung on a hook. Consider what the Sumerian architects understood well enough to encode into a narrative that survived 4,000 years. The items stripped at each gate were not accessories. Each one was a piece of the me, a Sumerian concept with no precise modern equivalent. Something like divine powers plus social functions plus the cognitive capacity to exercise them. Her crown was not just a crown. It was the part of her that could claim sovereignty over a territory. Her measuring rod was not just a tool. It was the part of her that could impose order on matter. By the time she reached Ereshkigal's throne, she had not simply been disarmed. She had been unpacked. Layer by layer, gate by gate, the architecture had extracted everything that made her her, leaving what arrived at the throne not as Inanna, the Queen of Heaven, but as a raw, undifferentiated presence. Divinity with no attribute attached to it. Power with no function remaining to exercise it. This is the mechanism that the biblical architects mapped onto the descending tiers of Sheol, with the specific chambers calibrated to extract specific layers. Abaddon strips the autobiographical self, the interior record of who you were and what you built. Bedrock strips the belief in agency. The roaring mire of the fourth tier strips the capacity for pattern recognition, the mind's ability to impose order on chaos. The fortified gates of Duma strip the expectation of exit. Salmavet strips the difference between the self and the dark. By the time a soul arrives at the seventh tier, it has been Inanna at the hook, everything external and then everything internal removed, sitting in the thermal violence of proximity to the core of the world, with nothing left to protect it and nothing left to lose. The difference between Inanna's descent and the descent of the human dead is that Inanna had a plan. She had Ninshubur waiting at the surface. She had built the path back into the architecture before she descended. And after 3 days on the hook, the gods sent 2 small creatures, formed from the dirt under the fingernails of a god, to bring her back. They descended to the throne room, mourned alongside Ereshkigal, who was in the agony of labor, and when the Queen of the Dead offered them anything in gratitude, they asked for the body on the hook. They sprinkled it with the food of life and the water of life 60 times, and Inanna rose. But here is the detail the popular retellings always omit. The underworld has a rule. Nothing leaves without sending something back in its place. Inanna could not simply return to the surface. She had to send a substitute. She ascended through the gates, and the grim beings of the underworld ascended with her, one hand gripping her, demanding her replacement. They passed through the surface cities of Sumer, and Inanna, who had survived the hook and the eyes of death and the stripping and the darkness, looked at her mourning friends who had been weeping for her at the threshold, and she refused to give them up. But when she found her husband Dumuzi sitting on his throne in fine clothes, ungrieved, comfortable in her absence, she looked at him with the eyes of death she had brought back from below, and she gave him to them. Dumuzi descended, and the seasons followed him. The animals stopped reproducing. The grain stopped growing. The surface world began to die because the fertility god was in the underworld, and the underworld does not return what it holds without a price. The myth resolves with a compromise, Dumuzi spending half the year in the depths and half the year on the surface, which is where the Sumerians located the mechanism that drives the seasons. Not in a distant divine decision, in the accounting system of the abyss. This is what I mean when I say the ancient Near East understood the underworld as infrastructure. The Sumerians were not writing poetry about death and rebirth. They were describing a closed system in which what descends eventually returns, but never without cost, never without transformation, and never without something else being sent down in its place. The underworld is not a one-way mechanism. It is an exchange, and the thing it exchanges is life. The thing it demands in return for every resurrection is something going down permanently. Standing here at the intersection of the Sumerian blueprint and the biblical architecture it seeded, I notice a connection that neither tradition fully names, but that both traditions imply with structural clarity. Every mythological system that includes a descent and return, from Inanna to Osiris to the later traditions that inherit them, encodes the same psychological observation. The person who comes back is not the same person who went down. The stripping is real. The hook is real. The 3 days in the dark are real, not as metaphysical events, but as descriptions of something that happens to the mind when it is deprived of every external anchor and left with nothing but itself. What the ancient architects mapped in geological terms is the same territory that contemplatives across every tradition have always known as the dark night of the soul, the place you arrive at when everything external has been taken, and you discover that the thing underneath either holds or it doesn't. Inanna held. She came back wearing the eyes of death she had borrowed from below, and she was more powerful for having survived the hook. The biblical Rephaim, the trembling shades of the human dead, could not hold. They had no ninshubur waiting at the surface, no plan built into the descent, no two small creatures sent with the food and water of life. They arrived at the dust, and they dissolved into it. But neither tradition quite accounts for the creature Mot. The Canaanite god of death is not Ereshkigal, who is at least a monarch, a being with a court and a throne, and the capacity for grief. Mot is something older and less organized than governance. In the Ugaritic texts of the Baal cycle, Mot is not a ruler. Mot is a body, a physiology, an anatomy of consumption so vast that his upper lip touches the heavens, and his lower lip drags along the earth, and his throat is a pit wide enough to swallow the sky. His stomach is not the seat of his desire. His stomach is Sheol. The underworld is not the place where Mot lives. It is the interior of what he is. This is the conceptualization the biblical writers adopted when they described Sheol as having a mouth, as opening wide without measure, as swallowing cities and armies and kings without distinction, and never being full. Sheol is not a place that operates like a mouth. In its most ancient conception, Sheol is the consequence of something being large enough and hungry enough to have an interior. The architecture is not a building, it is a body. The 7 tiers are not floors, they are organs. The system processes what enters it the way a living thing processes what it consumes. And the product of that processing is not fire or torment in the dramatic sense. It is dissolution. The return of everything borrowed from the surface to the primordial substrate from which it was drawn. And beneath all of it, beneath the 7 tiers and the watchers and the fire and the gates of iron and the stripping of the self and the body of Mot that contains the whole structure within it, beneath all of this is the Tehom, the water, the primordial ocean that existed before the first day of creation, before the light was separated from the dark, before the dry land appeared and the first seed was planted in the soil that would eventually produce the dust that Sheol was waiting to reclaim. The Sumerian equivalent is the Abzu, the vast freshwater aquifer beneath the earth, the reservoir from which all springs and rivers and underground waters draw. The architecture of the underworld, the tiers and the hollows and the prison of the stars, sits above the Abzu, the way a structure sits above its foundation. And this is where the map reveals something that no individual section of it contains. The Tehom is not evil. It is not a punishment. It is the deep that existed before any of the moral categories the later tradition would build above it. The fire of the seventh tier, the roaring cataracts of the fourth, the suffocating clay of the third, all of it is generated by proximity to the water at the bottom, by the hydraulic and thermal physics of a subterranean ocean that has been there since before the world was made. The underworld does not punish because someone decided it should. It processes because it is what it is, an extension of the deep that the creation story placed at the foundation of everything. When the author of Genesis wrote that the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters before the first day, they were writing about the Tehom. They were describing the breath of the divine moving across the surface of the same abyss that sits beneath the seventh tier of the underworld, the same deep that feeds the roaring cataracts of the fourth tier, the same primordial water that the architects of Sheol identified as the bedrock of the entire structure. Which means the floor of the underworld and the foundation of the world are the same thing. The abyss beneath the seventh tier is continuous with the waters that existed before light. The creation story and the geography of death share a substrate. The most terrifying place in the ancient cosmological imagination is made of the same material as the first moment of the world. Hold that thought, because it is the key to the paradox waiting in the last room. Every tradition that built this underworld, the Sumerians and the Akkadians and the Israelites and the architects of the Second Temple apocalyptic literature, assumed something that they never argued for, because they never imagined it could be questioned. They assumed that the abyss was the place God was not, the far shore, the territory beyond the reach of the divine authority that governed the living world. Sheol was the one space defined by the absence of everything the living world contained, including the presence that generated it. Then someone read Psalm 139 and could not escape what it said. If I ascend into heaven, thou art there. If I make my bed in Sheol, behold, thou art there. This is not a comforting statement. Read it again, slowly, in the context of everything we have just mapped. The throne of Ereshkigal, and the hook and the eyes of death. The seven tiers and their systematic stripping. The fire of the seventh tier, and the darkness that has become a substance in the sixth. The roaring cataracts, and the suffocating clay, and the dissolving of the self that carries memories of the surface world. God is there, in all of it. Not watching from a safe distance, not monitoring through intermediaries, not sustaining the system through a delegation of power. There, present. In the same way, God is present in heaven. Proverbs 15 says it with the flat certainty of a geological fact. Sheol and Abaddon are naked before the divine. The underworld has no secrets from the presence that made the world. The iron bars of the gates of death do not keep God out. Nothing keeps God out. The gates keep the dead in. And the entity that maintains the facility, that set the coordinate for Azazel's imprisonment in Dudael, that designed the four hollows of the interim state with their specific drainage systems for specific categories of soul, that generates the fire at the seventh tier through the physics of proximity to the divine nature, is not absent from the abyss. The abyss is full of it. And this is the detail that the ancient theologians spent their careers approaching without quite landing on. The detail that Jonathan Edwards got close to in the 18th century, when he observed that the saints in heaven and the condemned in hell are both, simultaneously, in the presence of the same divine fire. And the difference between them is not spatial, but relational. Not about distance, but about the condition of the thing exposed to the heat. A piece of clay set in a fire hardens. A piece of wax set in the same fire dissolves. The fire does not change. The substance receiving it determines the outcome. What the ancient cartographers of Sheol built, without being able to name it in these terms, was a cosmology in which the presence of God is not the solution to the problem of the underworld. It is the engine that drives it. The fire of Gehenna is not imported from somewhere else. It is generated by the proximity of absolute holiness to the substance of what has arrived there, stripped of everything. The raw material of a human existence after every external structure has been removed, sitting at the convergence point of the divine presence and the primordial deep. Two things that were present at the beginning, before the first day, the fire and the water, the divine and the abyss, together again in the lowest room, and the soul that arrives there experiences both of them without any insulation between its naked self and what they are. The translators who spent 3,000 years replacing Sheol with softer words were not confused about the meaning. They understood the meaning precisely. They chose softer words because the original meaning is the one that cannot be domesticated, the one that refuses to fit into any theological system that places God and the underworld on opposite sides of a line. The ancient Israelite cosmology did not have that line. The divine was not on one side and the void on the other. The divine was present on both sides and in the middle and at the foundation. And the difference between heaven and the lowest tier of Sheol was not a difference in who was there. It was a difference in what you are when you arrive. Here is the deepest irony embedded in this entire structure, the one that the mapping process reveals only when you have followed the descent all the way to the bottom and turned around to look back at where you started. We have spent 3,000 years assuming that the most terrifying aspect of death is the separation, the going away, the removal from light and warmth and presence into a place of silence and darkness and absence. The entire horror of the underworld, as most people conceive of it, is predicated on distance, on the idea that what waits beyond the threshold is a void defined by what it lacks. And the ancient cosmological tradition says, with a quiet and devastating clarity, you are not going somewhere God is not. You are going somewhere God is. You will be in the presence of the exact same fire that sustains the living world. The difference is that in the living world, the structures of your life, your relationships, your work, your memories, your daily rituals of self-construction, all of it serves as insulation between your raw self and the unmediated pressure of that presence. In the underworld, the insulation has been stripped away, gate by gate, tier by tier, one layer at a time, in the exact sequence the ancient architects designed. And now think about this in the terms the modern world actually understands. Every human being is in the presence of forces larger than themselves all the time. Every person alive is navigating unmediated proximity to something vast and inhuman, whether they call it God or physics or mortality, or the simple fact that the universe is approximately 14 billion years old and you are alive in it for a statistically negligible interval. The structures we build, the identities we construct, the daily routines and social roles and internal narratives we maintain, these are the me, the Sumerian concept, the items surrendered at the 7 gates. And there are moments in a life, moments of deep grief or catastrophic failure or illness, or the particular kind of silence that falls at 3 a.m. when you cannot sleep, when the insulation thins. When you feel the proximity of something vast and unresponsive, and utterly indifferent to whether you specifically survive the encounter. The ancient architects called that proximity Sheol. They gave it 7 rooms and a fire at the bottom, and a name that means hungry and hollow simultaneously. And they were honest, in a way that the translations have been quietly obscuring ever since, about the fact that the presence at the bottom of the abyss is the same presence at the top of the sky. That the thing you are most afraid of and the thing you are reaching toward when you reach toward anything sacred are, at their foundation, the same. So here's the question the ancient cartographers were really asking, and I want you to hold it, not answer it, because it has no answer that can be stated in fewer than 5 words. If you had descended all 7 tiers of the abyss, survived the stripping and the dissolution and the fire, and arrived back at the surface with the eyes of death that Inanna brought back, eyes that see through every structure of identity to the raw material underneath, would you use that vision to give the world something it is ready for? Or would you use it the way Inanna used it, turning to look at the comfortable, ungrieved king on his throne, the one who sat in prosperity while you were on the hook, and giving him to the beings who came back with you? And there is a thread in this story that was never resolved, a figure who descends further than Enoch surveyed, and whose fate the ancient texts refuse to speak of plainly. A power that fell from its celestial position not by accident, but by the same choice that sent the watchers through the boundary between above and below. A being whose name, in the oldest texts, is the morning star, whose descent, unlike Inanna's, included no ninshubur waiting at the surface, no plan for return, no 3 days with an ending. What that descent accomplished, what it changed about the architecture of the underworld itself, whether the fire at the 7th tier was different after the morning star arrived than it was before, is the question that the oldest surviving texts approach and then deliberately stop short of answering. You have been in the underworld this entire time. You descended with Enoch and Inanna and the scribes who drew the map in the dark. The only question that remains is what you noticed about yourself when the insulation thinned.